When Elena dared him to say her name, David thought it was about desire, until he realized she was asking him to remember how to be alive. David stared at his computer screen for what felt like the 100th time that evening. The clock in the corner showed 9:47 p.m. and the office had been empty for hours. This was becoming his new normal, staying late, going home to an empty apartment, and falling asleep to the sound of Netflix reruns. At 32, his life had settled into a routine that felt safe but incredibly lonely. The divorce papers had been signed 2 years ago, but the emotional walls he'd built were still standing strong. Trust didn't come easily anymore. He'd learned that people could say they loved you one day and pack their bags the next. So he kept things simple now. Work hard, hit the gym, keep conversations light, and don't let anyone get too close. 3 months ago, everything started to shift when Elena joined their architectural firm. She was the new graphic designer, brought in to help make their presentations more appealing to clients. David first noticed her during the Monday morning team meeting. While everyone else sat with their coffee and tired expressions, she had this energy about her that was hard to ignore. She wasn't trying to get attention. In fact, she seemed almost shy during that first meeting. But when their boss asked for ideas about the Morrison project, Elena spoke up with suggestions that made everyone sit up and listen. She had this way of seeing things differently, like she could picture exactly what clients needed before they even knew it themselves. Over the next few weeks, David found himself working closely with Elena on several projects. She had a habit of tilting her head slightly when she was concentrating, and her dark hair would fall across her shoulder. Sometimes he'd catch himself watching her work instead of focusing on his own tasks. She was always professional, always prepared, but there was something about her quiet confidence that drew him in. Their conversations started simple: project deadlines, client preferences, technical details. But gradually, they began to stretch longer. Elena would ask his opinion on design choices, and David found himself staying after meetings to discuss ideas that had nothing to do with work. She had traveled quite a bit before moving to their city, and her stories about different places made his own life feel small and predictable. One afternoon, while reviewing layouts for a hotel project, Elena mentioned how the design reminded her of a place she'd stayed in Barcelona. David had never been to Spain, had barely traveled anywhere since college. As she described the narrow streets and late-night conversations with strangers, he realized how much he'd closed himself off from new experiences. "You should travel more," she said, looking up from her laptop. "You have that architect's eye for spaces. I bet you'd see things in cities that most people miss." David shrugged. "Maybe someday. Work keeps me pretty busy." Elena smiled, but he caught something in her expression, like she could see right through his excuse. The truth was, traveling alone felt depressing, and he wasn't ready to travel with someone new. So he stayed put, stayed safe, stayed in control. The office holiday party arrived in December, one of those awkward corporate events where everyone tried too hard to have fun. David usually showed up for an hour, made the required small talk, and left early. But this year felt different. Elena wore a dark blue dress that made her eyes look almost golden under the party lights. She'd pulled her hair back, revealing small silver earrings that caught the light when she laughed. David found himself staying longer than usual, nursing a beer and watching Elena navigate conversations with different colleagues. She had this way of making people feel heard, asking questions that went beyond surface-level workplace chat. When the IT guy started talking about his weekend photography hobby, Elena listened like it was the most interesting thing in the world. Around 10 o'clock, the party started winding down. David was considering his exit strategy when Elena appeared beside him. "This is nice," she said, gesturing toward the decorated conference room. "But I'm ready for some fresh air. How are you getting home?" "I was going to call a ride," David replied. "My car's in the shop." "I can give you a lift," Elena offered. "I'm headed in that direction anyway." The December air was sharp and cold as they walked to her car. David's breath made small clouds in the darkness, and he could smell Elena's perfume, something light and floral that suited her perfectly. Her car was small and tidy, with a coffee cup in the holder and a book on the passenger seat that she quickly moved to make room for him. The drive to his apartment should have taken 15 minutes, but somehow they ended up parked outside his building an hour later, still talking. The conversation had started with work, moved to favorite movies, then somehow shifted to more personal territory. Elena told him about her recent move to the city, how she'd left a long-term relationship that had grown stagnant and predictable. "We were together for 4 years," she explained, her hands resting on the steering wheel. "Good people, both of us, but we'd stopped growing together. It was comfortable, but not alive, you know." David understood more than he wanted to admit. His marriage had ended for different reasons, but the feeling of being stuck was familiar. "It's scary to start over," he said. "Terrifying," Elena agreed. But staying in something that wasn't working felt worse than being alone. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a few late-night joggers pass under the streetlights. David realized he didn't want the conversation to end. When was the last time he'd talked to someone, really talked, without watching the clock or planning his exit? "Would you like to come up for coffee?" The words came out before he could stop them. "I mean actual coffee. I have this fancy machine I never use." Elena turned to look at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition, like she'd been hoping he would ask. "I'd like that," she said softly. As they rode the elevator to his floor, David felt his heart beating faster. This wasn't his usual pattern. He didn't bring colleagues home, didn't blur the lines between work and personal life, but something about Elena made him want to break his own rules. She stood close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, and when she looked up at him with those golden brown eyes, he felt something inside him shift, something he'd kept carefully locked away for the past 2 years. The elevator doors opened, and David fumbled with his keys, suddenly nervous about what Elena would think of his space. His life, his carefully controlled world. But as she followed him down the hallway, he realized he wanted her to see it all. David's apartment reflected everything about his personality: clean lines, neutral colors, and nothing out of place. As Elena stepped inside, she took her time looking around. Her eyes moved from the architectural book stacked neatly on the coffee table to the single-framed photograph on the bookshelf. Him with 3 college friends at graduation, all of them grinning and throwing their caps in the air. "This is very you," she said with a small smile, running her finger along the spine of a design magazine. "Everything has its place." David felt suddenly self-conscious. His apartment had always felt comfortable to him, but seeing it through Elena's eyes made it seem almost sterile. "I like things organized," he said, heading toward the kitchen. "Makes life simpler." "Nothing wrong with simple," Elena replied, settling onto his couch. "But sometimes simple can become empty." The comment hit deeper than David expected. He busied himself with the coffee machine, grateful for something to do with his hands. Elena was right, though he'd never thought about it that way. His life had become a series of routines designed to avoid complications, to avoid getting hurt again. "So tell me about this fancy coffee machine you never use," Elena called from the living room. "Wedding gift," David admitted, measuring out beans. "Figured I should finally put it to good use." When he returned with 2 mugs, Elena had made herself comfortable on his couch, her shoes kicked off and legs tucked under her. She looked so natural there, like she belonged in his carefully controlled space. They talked about everything and nothing. Elena told him about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, how she'd always dreamed of living in a big city where she could be anonymous, free to reinvent herself. David found himself sharing stories he hadn't thought about in years: college adventures, his first job at a struggling firm, the excitement of landing his current position. "What about your marriage?" Elena asked gently, after David mentioned his ex-wife in passing. David's first instinct was to change the subject, give some generic answer about growing apart. But something about the way Elena looked at him, patient, understanding, not pushing, made him want to be honest. "We met in college," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "Everything felt so easy back then. We had the same goals, same timeline: graduate, get jobs, get married, buy a house. We checked all the boxes, but somewhere along the way we stopped actually seeing each other. We were like roommates following a script. When she told me she'd been having an affair for 6 months, I was hurt, but I wasn't surprised. We'd been sleepwalking through our lives." Elena reached over and touched his hand briefly. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." The worst part was realizing I'd been doing it too. Not having an affair but checking out emotionally. I'd built these walls without even noticing. And now? Elena asked. David looked at her. Really looked at her. Elena wasn't just beautiful, though she was that too. There was something about her presence that made him want to be more honest, more real than he'd been in years. Now I'm scared of making the same mistakes, he admitted. It's easier to keep people at a distance than risk getting hurt again. Elena nodded thoughtfully. I understand that. After my relationship ended, I told myself I'd focus on work, on building a new life. But loneliness is its own kind of hurt. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. David noticed how the lamplight caught the highlights in Elena's hair, how she'd relaxed completely into his space. When was the last time someone had felt this comfortable in his home? Elena stood up and walked to his window, which offered a view of the city lights stretching into the distance. It's beautiful, she said. All those lights, all those lives happening at the same time. David joined her at the window, standing close enough to smell her perfume again. I never really look at it anymore, he admitted. Just another part of the routine. Elena turned to face him, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with possibility. That's sad, she said softly. Beautiful things deserve to be noticed. David's heart started beating faster. Elena was standing so close he could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. For 2 years, he'd kept everyone at arm's length, convinced that safety was worth more than connection. But looking at Elena now, he realized how much he'd been missing. I don't usually do this, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't usually go home with colleagues, don't usually let myself get interested. But something about you makes me want to be braver than I normally am. Braver how? David asked, though he thought he knew the answer. Elena smiled, a mix of nervousness and determination crossing her face. Braver about taking chances, about being honest about what I want. The air between them seemed to vibrate with possibility. David realized they were standing at a crossroads. They could step back, keep things professional, maintain the safe distance they'd both grown comfortable with. Or they could step forward into something uncertain and potentially wonderful. What happened next surprised them both with its intensity. Elena moved closer, close enough that David could feel her breath on his cheek. Her hand came up to rest on his chest, right over his heart, which was beating so hard he was sure she could feel it. I have a confession, Elena said, her eyes never leaving his. I've been thinking about this moment since that first team meeting. Not this exactly, but this feeling. This possibility. David's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Elena. Say my name, she interrupted, her voice soft but challenging. Really say it. Not like you're reading it off an email, but like you actually see me. David realized what she meant. For months, they'd been dancing around each other with professional courtesy and careful distance. Even tonight, even in this moment, part of him was still holding back, still protecting himself from the possibility of real connection. Elena, he said, this time with intention, with recognition of who she was and what she was offering him. Her smile was radiant. Better. But I don't think you're quite there yet. What do you mean? Elena stepped back slightly, her hands moving to the hem of her sweater. I mean, you're still hiding behind those walls, still keeping part of yourself locked away. She pulled the sweater over her head, revealing a simple black top underneath. I dare you to really see me, to be present with me instead of planning your escape route. David's breath caught. This wasn't just about physical attraction, though that was definitely there. Elena was asking him to be vulnerable, to drop his guard completely and trust her with his heart. I'm scared, he admitted, the words coming out more honest than he'd intended. Good, Elena said, moving closer again. Being scared means it matters. Being scared means you're alive. She was right. For 2 years, David had chosen numbness over fear, safety over possibility. But standing here with Elena, feeling his heart race and his defenses crumble, he remembered what it felt like to be fully alive. Elena. He said her name again, this time with complete presence, complete acknowledgement of who she was and what this moment meant. Much better, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. What followed was a conversation without words, 2 people choosing to trust each other, to be vulnerable together, to risk their carefully constructed safety for something real and uncertain. David realized that Elena's dare wasn't really about saying her name. It was about being present. about showing up completely instead of keeping one foot out the door. As they moved together in the soft lamplight, David understood that this was what he'd been missing. Not just physical connection, but emotional presence. The courage to be fully himself with another person. Elena had shown him that real intimacy required ongoing choice, ongoing bravery, ongoing willingness to be seen. David woke up to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and the sound of water running in his kitchen. For a moment he felt disoriented. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and his heart started racing for entirely different reasons than it had just hours before. Elena was making coffee. He could smell it brewing and hear her moving around quietly, probably trying not to wake him. The intimacy they'd shared in the darkness suddenly felt complicated in the harsh light of morning. What did this mean? How were they supposed to act now? They had to work together, sit in meetings together, pretend nothing had changed. David pulled on a t-shirt and walked to the kitchen, finding Elena fully dressed, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked beautiful but guarded, like she was already putting her professional armor back on. "Good morning," she said, offering him a small smile. "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't figure out your fancy machine, so I just used the regular coffee maker." "That's perfect," David replied, accepting the mug she handed him. "Thank you." They stood on opposite sides of his kitchen island, suddenly feeling like strangers again. The easy intimacy of the night before seemed like something that had happened to other people. David watched Elena fidget with her coffee cup and realized she was just as uncertain as he was. "So," Elena said finally, "we should probably talk about this." "Probably," David agreed, though he had no idea what to say. Elena took a deep breath. "Last night was incredible. I want you to know that." "I don't regret it, not for a second." "Neither do I," David said quickly. "It's just complicated," Elena finished. "I know, we work together. People will notice if we start acting differently around each other." David nodded, relief flooding through him that she understood. "The last thing I want is for this to make things awkward for you at the office." "Or for you," Elena said. "I like my job. I like working with you. I don't want to mess that up." They sipped their coffee in silence, both lost in thought. David found himself studying Elena's face, memorizing the way the morning light highlighted her cheekbones, the small scar above her left eyebrow that he'd noticed the night before when they were close enough to notice everything. "What if we take this slowly?" Elena suggested. "Figure out what this is without putting pressure on it." "What does slowly look like?" David asked. Elena smiled, and for the first time that morning it reached her eyes. "I don't know. Maybe we start with being honest about the fact that something has changed between us, even if we're not sure what it means yet." "I can do honest," David said. "Good, because I should tell you, I'm going to have a hard time concentrating in meetings now, especially when you do that thing where you lean back in your chair and run your hand through your hair when you're thinking." David laughed, surprised by her directness. "You notice that?" "I've been noticing a lot of things about you for months," Elena admitted. "I just wasn't sure if you were noticing me back." "I was," David said. "Definitely noticing." They finished their coffee with easier conversation, making plans to meet for lunch later in the week, somewhere away from the office where they could talk without worrying about who might overhear. Elena gathered her things and David walked her to the door. "See you at work," she said, then stood on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek softly. "Thank you for last night. For being brave with me." After she left, David stood in his empty apartment, still smelling her perfume in the air. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. The carefully controlled life he'd built suddenly felt too small, like he'd been living in a box without realizing it. At work, the awareness between them was electric. During the Monday morning team meeting, David found himself hyper-aware of every move Elena made. When she reached across the table for a pen, he noticed the grace in her movements. When she spoke up with ideas for the Peterson project, he admired her confidence and creativity in a completely new way. Elena seemed to be experiencing the same heightened awareness. When their boss assigned them to work together on the downtown hotel renovation, David caught her trying to hide a smile. Later, when they were alone in the conference room reviewing floor plans, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same document, and the simple contact sent electricity up David's arm. "This is going to be interesting," Elena murmured, not moving her hand away immediately. "The project?" David asked, though he knew that wasn't what she meant. Everything, Elena replied, her eyes meeting his. Over the next few days, David began to see Elena differently in ways that had nothing to do with their physical connection. He noticed how she always made time to help younger employees with their questions. He saw how she lit up when talking about design concepts, her passion for her work evident in every gesture. He observed her small acts of kindness, bringing coffee for the receptionist who looked tired, staying late to help a colleague meet a deadline. Elena, meanwhile, seemed to be seeing through his protective mechanisms with uncomfortable clarity. During a client presentation, when David defaulted to his safe professional demeanor, she caught his eye and raised an eyebrow slightly as if to say, "Where did you go?" It was a gentle challenge, but effective. David found himself speaking more authentically for the rest of the meeting. 3 weeks after that first night together, David realized he was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble he'd expected, workplace complications or gossip. The real trouble was that he was falling in love with Elena, and it scared him more than he wanted to admit. She'd become woven into his thoughts, disrupting his carefully maintained routines in the best possible way. He found himself checking his phone for her messages, looking forward to their lunch meetings with an anticipation that reminded him of being 16 again. When she suggested they have dinner at her place on Friday night, his first instinct was to make an excuse, to find a reason to slow things down before they got too real. But something stopped him. Maybe it was remembering how alive he'd felt that first night. Or maybe it was the growing realization that his safe, controlled life was actually a pretty lonely way to live. Elena's apartment was everything his wasn't. Plants everywhere, candles on every surface, artwork covering the walls in a riot of color and creativity. Books were stacked in corners. Photos of friends and family covered the refrigerator, and there was evidence everywhere of a life lived fully and without apology. "Wow," David said, taking it all in. "This is incredible." "It's a mess," Elena laughed, moving a stack of magazines off the couch. "I keep meaning to organize better, but I like having my things around me. They tell stories." Over dinner, pasta that Elena had made from scratch because of course she could cook too, they talked about their weeks, their projects, their colleagues. But David could sense Elena watching him, studying him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see right through his defenses. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said as they cleared the dishes. "Sure. What are you afraid of?" The question caught David off guard. "What do you mean?" Elena dried her hands on a dish towel, then turned to face him fully. "You said my name that night at your apartment. Really said it like you were seeing me completely. But since then, it's like you've been stepping backward, putting distance between us even when we're sitting right next to each other." David felt his chest tighten. Elena was right, and they both knew it. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Elena said gently. "And I understand it. I'm scared too. But I'd rather be scared and honest than safe and alone." David leaned against the kitchen counter, looking at this woman who had somehow managed to see straight into his heart. "I'm afraid of getting hurt again," he admitted. "I'm afraid of hurting you. I'm afraid of messing up something good because I don't know how to do this right." "Do what right?" "This." David gestured between them. "Be vulnerable. Trust someone. Let someone matter to me." Elena moved closer, reaching for his hands. "What if there is no right way? What if we just figure it out as we go? What if we mess it up? What if we don't?" Elena countered. "What if we're brave enough to find out what this could become?" David looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Elena's face. She was offering him something he'd convinced himself he didn't want, the chance to be fully known by another person, to risk his heart for the possibility of real love. "I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "And that terrifies me." Elena's smile was radiant. "Good. Because I'm falling in love with you too, and if I have to be terrified alone, that's not fair." David laughed despite his fear. "So what do we do now?" "Now we choose," Elena said. "Every day we choose to be brave together. We choose to stay present instead of running away when things get scary. We choose to keep saying each other's names like we really mean it." David understood then what Elena had been trying to teach him from the beginning. Love wasn't about finding someone safe. It was about being brave enough to be unsafe with the right person. "Elena," he said her name deliberately, meeting her eyes with complete presence, complete commitment to whatever came next. "Much better," she whispered, reaching up to kiss him. "Now you're getting it."